It was the middle of February, cold and gray, like the inside of my heart. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out of the window at the snow-covered streets of Chicago. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it, and mine had been a series of fastballs straight to the gut. I was Claire, and I had lost everything that mattered. My job, my home, and most painfully, the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. He left me without explanation, without warning, like a gust of wind that blows out a flame. What was left of me was nothing but ashes. I had never imagined that life could be this cruel. Each day felt like a battle just to get out of bed. The mornings were the worst. Waking up meant facing reality. And reality was a place I no longer wanted to exist in. There was no hope in my heart, no faith left in my soul. It was as if the universe had conspired to rip away everything I once held dear. The weight of despair pressed down on me so hard that breathing felt like an effort. I stopped looking for signs of God's presence. Maybe He had given up on me, too. Daily blessings. Positive mindset. Those words were nothing but empty promises, printed on motivational posters to cheer up someone who hadn't walked in my shoes. Spiritual growth. How could one grow from pain so deep, so raw? All I saw was darkness, stretching endlessly before me. I'd grown up believing that God had a plan for everyone, but standing there, in the quiet desolation of my room, I was no longer sure if that plan included me. There was a hollow emptiness inside me, and every day I felt it growing larger, swallowing whatever joy, peace, or hope I had left. I tried to distract myself with mundane things, work, television, even scrolling through social media, but none of it helped. It was like putting a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. I had no motivation to seek out divine guidance, no inspiration to be found. If this was a test of my faith, I was failing miserably. But what scared me the most was not the absence of joy. It was the growing anger. Anger at God, at life, at everything. My inner strength had withered away, replaced by resentment. Every morning, instead of gratitude, I woke up filled with rage. Why me? Why now? What had I done to deserve this? Serenity, mindfulness, forgiveness, these things were alien concepts. My soul was a battlefield, and I was losing the war. Then, one particularly dreary day, I decided to take a walk. It wasn't for peace or reflection. I just needed to escape the four walls that felt like they were closing in on me. I wandered aimlessly through the city, my mind clouded with thoughts of hopelessness. As I walked past a small church, I heard the soft hum of voices inside. For some reason, my feet stopped moving. I stood outside the doors, hesitant, listening. Something about the calmness, the harmony of voices, gave me pause. I can't say what it was that drew me in, perhaps desperation, or maybe a tiny spark of curiosity. I opened the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit me first, a stark contrast to the freezing cold outside. The church was almost empty, except for a few people seated in quiet prayer. My eyes were drawn to a woman near the front, her head bowed. I watched her, not knowing why, but something about her presence made me want to sit. I slipped into a pew at the back, feeling out of place, like an intruder in a sacred space. For the first time in months, I closed my eyes. I didn't pray. I didn't even think about praying. But I sat there, in the quiet, letting the stillness wrap around me. Maybe it was just the church's silence, or the soft glow of candles flickering in the distance, but I felt something stir inside me. It wasn't joy or peace, but a tiny flicker of hope, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end for me. That night, I went home and, for the first time in a long time, I said a simple prayer. It wasn't eloquent or full of affirmations. It was raw, honest, and desperate. I asked God for one thing, to help me find my way back. To give me strength, because I was lost and too tired to keep fighting alone. The next morning, I woke up feeling different, but not in the way I had hoped. Instead of finding the strength I had prayed for, I was greeted by a wave of overwhelming exhaustion. My body felt heavy, my heart even heavier. That flicker of hope I'd felt in the church the day before seemed to have been extinguished overnight. I had expected some kind of miracle, a sign that God was listening to me. But all I found was silence. The kind of silence that eats away at your soul, making you question if anyone is out there at all. I dragged myself out of bed, going through the motions of the day. As I prepared a cup of coffee, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman staring back at me looked like a stranger. Pale, with hollow eyes, her face lined with stress and sleepless nights. This was not the Claire I once knew. That Claire was full of life, laughter, and energy. Now, I barely recognized myself. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt joy, real joy, the kind that makes your chest swell with gratitude. The days blurred together after that. It was as if I were sleepwalking through life, numb to everything around me. I went to work, I came home, and I repeated the cycle. There was no spark, no motivation, nothing that made me want to get up in the morning. Each day felt like an eternity, and I was drowning in the monotony of it all. I still tried to pray, but it felt forced, like I was speaking into an empty void. My words echoed back at me, unanswered, and each day that passed made me feel more and more abandoned. One evening, after yet another long day, I received a phone call that would shatter whatever fragile sense of stability I had left. My mother, the one person who had always been a source of strength and comfort for me, had fallen ill. The doctors didn't know what was wrong, but it was serious. I could hear the tremor in her voice, the fear she tried to hide behind her words. It tore me apart inside. My mother had always been the pillar of our family, the one who held everything together. And now, she was the one who needed help, and I was powerless to do anything about it. I rushed to her side, feeling the familiar sting of panic settle in my chest. When I saw her lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines, my heart broke. She looked so small, so fragile. The woman who had always been my rock was now fighting for her life, and I couldn't bear it. I sat by her bedside, holding her hand, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. Every beep of the machines felt like a countdown, a reminder of how fragile life truly was. I prayed harder that night than I had ever prayed before. Not for myself, but for her. I begged God to heal her, to give her the strength to pull through. But as the days passed and her condition worsened, I felt the familiar anger rising up inside me again. Why? Why was this happening? Hadn't I been through enough? First, I lost my job, then my relationship, and now my mother. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on me, testing me to see just how much I could take before I broke completely. Every day, I sat by her side, watching her fade away. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do, that it was only a matter of time. Hearing those words felt like a knife to the heart. I couldn't accept it. I wouldn't. My mother was a fighter. She had always been the strongest person I knew, and I refused to believe that this was how her story would end. I spent hours talking to her, telling her stories from my childhood, hoping that somehow, my words would reach her, that she would find the strength to wake up and come back to me. But she didn't. And with every passing day, the hope I clung to slipped further and further away. I found myself questioning everything, my faith, my beliefs, my purpose. Where was the peace I was promised? The joy that was supposed to come from trusting in God's plan? All I felt was pain, deep and unrelenting, like a wound that refused to heal. The daily blessings that people spoke of, the spiritual growth they touted, felt like distant dreams, unattainable in the face of such overwhelming despair. One night, after another long vigil at the hospital, I found myself walking through the empty streets, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. The cold air bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I was lost in my thoughts, consumed by the weight of everything I was carrying. I found myself back at that same church I had wandered into weeks before. I hadn't planned on going, but my feet had carried me there nonetheless. I stepped inside, the warmth enveloping me once again. The church was empty, save for a few candles flickering in the dim light. I sat down in the same pew, the weight of my exhaustion pressing down on me. I had nothing left to give, no more words to say. I stared up at the altar, the statue of Christ looming above me, his arms outstretched. And for the first time in my life, I broke down. I cried, harder than I had ever cried before. The sobs racked my body, shaking me to my core. I wasn't just grieving for my mother. I was grieving for everything I had lost, for the person I used to be, for the life I once had. It was in that moment of complete vulnerability that I finally let go. I let go of the anger, the bitterness, the resentment. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't carry the weight of it alone anymore. I whispered a simple prayer, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the church. Help me, God. I don't know what to do. Please, help me. The days following that night in the church felt like a blur. Nothing had really changed. My mother was still in the hospital, her condition steadily worsening, and I still felt like I was walking through life in a fog, searching for a way out that I couldn't seem to find. But something inside me had shifted. The desperation I had carried for so long had eased just a little. It wasn't hope, not yet, but more like a quiet surrender. I had stopped expecting answers, stopped looking for signs. I simply woke up every day, survived through it, and fell back into bed at night, exhausted but numb. As the weeks passed, I began to dread the ringing of my phone. Each time it vibrated in my pocket, my heart raced, fearing the worst. And then, one fateful morning, that dreaded call came. I was in the middle of grocery shopping, standing in the cereal aisle, when my phone buzzed in my hand. I didn't recognize the number, but deep down, I knew what it was before I even answered. The doctor's voice on the other end of the line was calm but heavy with the weight of what he had to say. "She's not going to make it through the night, Claire. I'm so sorry." The world around me seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the edge of the shopping cart, my knuckles white, trying to steady myself. His words echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. My mother, my best friend, my only constant in this chaotic world, was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I couldn't even bring myself to respond. The weight of it all was too much, too crushing. My vision blurred with tears as I abandoned the cart and stumbled out of the store, gasping for air like I had been underwater for far too long. I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding in my chest the entire way there. When I arrived, the sight of her lying there, so still, so fragile, nearly broke me. Machines beeped rhythmically, but her breathing was shallow, labored. The doctors had done all they could. Now, it was up to fate, or God, or whatever power governed this world, to decide what would happen next. I sat beside her, holding her frail hand in mine, my thumb tracing small circles over her cold skin. There were no words left. I had already said everything I could think of in the days before, already poured out every ounce of love, anger, and sorrow. Now, all I could do was sit in silence, waiting for the inevitable, praying that somehow, she wouldn't have to suffer anymore. But the hours dragged on, and she didn't go. She just lay there, teetering on the edge, neither alive nor dead, caught in some cruel limbo. I felt a new wave of frustration wash over me, mixing with the grief that had settled deep in my bones. What kind of God would let this happen? What kind of mercy was this, to let someone linger in this state, caught between life and death, with no peace, no release? The room was unbearably quiet, save for the hum of the machines, and I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. My mind was spiraling, consumed by thoughts of everything I'd done wrong, everything I hadn't said or done. Guilt clawed at me, and I found myself questioning my every choice, every moment that had led to this one. If I had prayed harder, would this have happened? If I had been a better daughter, would God have spared her this suffering? The questions swirled endlessly, each one more painful than the last. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take another second, the door creaked open, and a nurse quietly stepped inside. She gave me a sad, knowing smile as she checked the machines, her eyes soft with sympathy. "She's still holding on," the nurse whispered, as if that was supposed to bring me comfort. But all it did was tighten the knot of dread in my stomach. Holding on to what? There was nothing left for her here, nothing but pain. Hours passed, and night fell, casting long shadows across the sterile walls of the hospital room. I hadn't left her side, too afraid that if I did, she would slip away the moment I wasn't looking. I couldn't bear the thought of her leaving this world without me there, without me holding her hand, telling her it was okay to let go. But then something strange happened. As I sat there in the stillness, I felt a change in the air. It wasn't something I could explain, but it was as if the room had suddenly become lighter, less oppressive. I looked down at my mother, and for the first time in days, her breathing seemed easier, less labored. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, and she looked at me, really looked at me, her gaze filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Claire," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "thank you." My heart clenched in my chest as I stared at her, confused. "Thank you? For what?" I hadn't done anything. I had just been here, watching her suffer, powerless to help. But the look in her eyes was clear, full of love, full of peace, and in that moment, I realized what she meant. She wasn't thanking me for anything I had done. She was thanking me for being here, for staying by her side, for not letting her face this alone. A tear slipped down my cheek as I squeezed her hand, unable to find the words to respond. But before I could say anything, her eyes fluttered shut again, and her breathing became shallow once more. The moment had passed, and we were right back where we started, waiting, watching, hoping for an end to the suffering. The hours stretched on, and eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I laid my head on the edge of the bed, holding her hand as I drifted off into a fitful sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, the room was quiet, too quiet. The machines that had been beeping steadily were now silent, and a cold chill ran down my spine as I realized what had happened. My mother was gone. The pain hit me all at once, like a tidal wave crashing over me, and I collapsed into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. She was gone, and there was no bringing her back. The one person who had always been there for me, who had loved me unconditionally, was no longer in this world. And I felt completely, utterly alone. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, and for a long time, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but cry. I had prayed for a miracle, and in the end, I had been given the opposite. There was no peace, no happy ending, just an empty hospital room and the unbearable weight of loss pressing down on me. But in the midst of my sorrow, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something I hadn't expected to hear. It wasn't over yet. There was still more to this story, even if I couldn't see it now. And though I didn't know it at the time, that voice would prove to be right. The days following my mother's passing were the darkest I'd ever known. I moved through them like a ghost, barely able to eat, sleep, or even think. The house felt unbearably empty without her in it. Every corner, every chair, every mug on the kitchen counter was a reminder of her absence. It was as though the world had lost its color, and I was trapped in this muted, hollow existence. I found myself questioning everything. My faith, my prayers, my very purpose in life. How could I continue to believe in a God who allowed such suffering, who had taken my mother from me when I had begged so desperately for him to save her? The anger and sorrow were overwhelming, and I felt myself sinking into a pit of despair, deeper than I had ever fallen before. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. The pain, while still sharp, started to dull around the edges. I found myself remembering my mother not just in her final, fragile moments but in all the vibrant, beautiful memories we had shared. Her laughter at the kitchen table, the way she would dance around the living room when her favorite song came on, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her faith. Slowly, those memories began to bring comfort rather than pain. One morning, I woke up to the sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like the weight of the world was crushing me. I sat up, stretched, and, without even thinking, whispered, "Thank you, God." It was such a small moment, so insignificant, and yet it felt monumental. I hadn't spoken to him in months, hadn't been able to muster a single word of prayer. But in that moment, gratitude welled up inside me, gratitude not for the pain or the loss, but for the fact that I had survived it. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for that tiny spark of faith, everything began to change. It started with a visit to my mother's grave. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go before. The idea of standing there, facing the reality of her absence, had been too much. But on that day, something pushed me to go. I stood there, staring at her name etched into the stone, and felt the familiar ache in my chest. But instead of crumbling under the weight of it, I found myself talking to her. Out loud. I told her everything, about the anger, the grief, the doubt, and even the small glimmer of hope I had begun to feel. And as I spoke, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no flash of light or booming voice from the heavens. But as I stood there, the wind gently rustling the trees around me, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long, long time. It was as though, in that quiet cemetery, I could hear my mother's voice, soft and steady, reminding me that life wasn't about avoiding pain but about finding strength through it. That night, for the first time since her passing, I prayed. Not for a miracle, not for answers, but simply to reconnect with the faith I had once held so tightly. I thanked God, not just for the good things in my life but for the challenges, too. For the ways they had shaped me, strengthened me. And as I whispered those words into the stillness, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. My mother's death hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of mine. From that moment on, things started to change. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life. I found comfort in the routine of daily prayer, in starting each day with gratitude, even if it was just for the small things. I began attending church again, feeling a sense of community that I hadn't realized I'd missed. The sermons, the hymns, the quiet moments of reflection, all of it felt like nourishment for my soul. But the real miracle came in the form of something I never expected: joy. Genuine, unfiltered joy. It crept up on me slowly, in the laughter of a child I passed on the street, in the warmth of the sun on my face during an afternoon walk, in the shared smiles with strangers at the grocery store. I began to notice beauty in the mundane, in the simple act of being alive. One day, as I was cleaning out my mother's old things, I stumbled upon a letter she had written to me. It was tucked away in the back of her dresser, wrapped in an old scarf I hadn't seen her wear in years. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, and tears filled my eyes as I began to read. "Claire, my love, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you in this world. But don't think for a second that I've left you. I am with you every day, in every laugh, in every sunrise, in every breath. Life is full of hardships, my dear, but it is also full of beauty. Promise me you'll never stop looking for it. Promise me you'll keep finding reasons to smile, to laugh, to love. And above all, always start the day by thanking God. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He's never left you, and neither have I, love, Mom." I clutched that letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face, and I knew in that moment that I had been given something far more precious than I had ever asked for. My mother's love, her faith, her spirit, they were still with me, guiding me, even in her absence. From that day forward, I lived differently. I woke up each morning and whispered a simple prayer of thanks. I looked for joy in the small things, found peace in the quiet moments, and strengthened my connection with God, knowing that He had been with me all along, even in my darkest days. And as the years passed, I realized that the miracle I had been searching for wasn't in my mother's healing or in some grand display of divine intervention. It was in the way I had been transformed through the pain, in the way I had learned to live fully, love deeply, and start each day with gratitude. In the end, it wasn't the absence of suffering that brought me peace. It was the realization that, through it all, I had never been alone. I had been carried, held, and guided by a love that transcended time, space, and even death. And that, I realized, was the greatest blessing of all.
Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Shrine of Lightness, and turn on notifications to keep receiving inspiring stories of faith. Together, let's open our hearts to the divine and witness the restoration comes from trusting in God.